Okay, so George Washington retires, and we are now into the election of 1796. We've got two candidates, Thomas Jefferson, a Democratic Republican, and John Adams, a Federalist. Now, Adams was the vice president to George Washington. Thomas Jefferson was Washington's Secretary of State. So both of these men have had experience in government, with Adams having vice presidential experience. And he also ran against Washington in that first election. And the way it used to work was whoever got the second most votes or whoever was in second place in the voting became the vice president. That eventually changed as political parties started to form and divide people. So it wouldn't make sense anymore to have the person you're running against, who is most likely of the opposite political party, be your vice president. So according to the Constitution, like we said, the candidate with the most electoral votes became president, and the one with the second most became vice president. So in the election of 1796, John Adams received more votes than Jefferson, which made Jefferson his vice president. And again, we saw how the division of these two political parties, Federalists and Democratic Republicans, starts to create a problem. And it continues on, and this is what raised eyebrows about this system of first place and second place being president and vice president isn't going to work if we still have political parties. And again, it's an instance where George Washington would look back and say, this is one of the reasons why. So there's something that goes on called the XYZ affair. And we talked about Jay's Treaty last week. And Jay's Treaty was this agreement between the United States and Great Britain, where the British were attacking our ships at sea, stealing stuff off of them, kidnapping sailors and forcing them to work for the British ships. Otherwise, they would be thrown in the ocean with the sharks. And so when we reached this agreement with Jay's Treaty and the United States got the bulk of the good from that deal, France sees this and says, wait a minute, why are they on peaceful terms now? Why did they come to this agreement? Does that mean that the United States and the British are allies now? We don't like that. They felt spurned by the United States. And so France starts to seize American ships and they start to harass our ships at sea. And this really angered Americans because at first they were upset at the British and said, we can't stand for this. And they felt that Jay's Treaty allowed the British to get away with basically just making a fake apology. And now France is following suit. So Americans were already upset. Now they're furious and say, you know what, we need to send a message. If we didn't do it against the British, we really need to do it against the French because the French seem to be disrespecting us. But John Adams, wanting to avoid war and following Washington's advice of trying to steer clear of any more debt, and that includes personal debt, meaning like lives that could be lost from a war, he successfully negotiates a peace treaty to avoid war with France. And that really was the biggest accomplishment and the highest mark of John Adams' 4 years as president. Okay. Unfortunately for him and the Federalists, there were a lot more that went wrong under John Adams than there was that went right. But the biggest thing that he did well was to keep us out of war. So France sent 3 agents, and they were referred to as agents X, Y, and Z to talk to American diplomats. And they basically said, we'll stop seizing your ships. We'll leave you alone if you pay us money. So go back to that discussion question I sent. Imagine that somebody is bullying you and you ask them and say, hey, can you knock it off? It's not cool. I don't like what you're doing. And they say, yeah, I'll leave you alone if you pay me $3 a day. All right. You're probably not going to think that that's going to be fair. What they're doing is, a borderline crime. It's assault, it's harassment, and, it's within your rights to not have them do that. So paying them money to get them to stop seems way out of the question. And so again, France tries to make a bribe, and Adams says, no, we're not going to pay you a bribe. So he strengthens the United States Navy and declares war at sea. So he says, if you're not going to leave us alone, then we will send our military out and we will attack you. And France kind of gets scared off by this, and the seizing of American ships stopped. So this is another thing that you could point to John Adams and say, well, this went well, and this was one of the main reasons why it helped keep us out of another war that we weren't ready for. Now, there was also 2 acts that he passed, or 2 laws essentially that he created to try and strengthen the power of the government, which at the time was controlled by Federalists. So keep that in mind. The first thing he did was he passed something called the Alien Act, which allowed the president to get rid of any foreigner thought to be dangerous to this country. It also made it harder for immigrants to become citizens. And while they used the platform that they were trying to keep America safe, really what it was is they were trying to strong arm and force non-American citizens into voting for the Federalists. So he thought, if we threaten to deport you, if we threaten to get rid of you out of this country just because you look suspicious, if you help us and if you vote for us and if you side with us and don't cause any issues for our political party, then we'll leave you alone. And so this was something that Democratic Republicans pointed out and said, this is another example of how federal government with too much power is a bad thing, because they're not doing this for the sake of the country. They're doing this to help their own political party. Another act that was passed shortly after the Alien Act was called the Sedition Act. And the Sedition Act would put in jail or make citizens pay a fine if they criticized the government or if they were found to start any sort of revolutions or riots or protests. So basically, it was against the law now for anybody to speak out and criticize the government, which would then eventually possibly lead to riots and revolutions. And so this one made a little bit more sense because we don't want riots. We don't want violent revolts. However, it kind of goes against our First Amendment right of freedom of expression and our freedom to peacefully assemble. So Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, again, point to this and say the Alien Act shows that our government has too much power because the Federalists made it that way. The Sedition Act makes it seem that our government has too much power and really hurts us. So the Alien Act didn't really bother too many American-born citizens or people who were not heavily influenced by a foreign culture. But the Sedition Act is really one that upset the Americans because they felt that if somebody's doing something wrong, they need to be made aware of it. Otherwise, those wrongs are going to continue to happen. And it's kind of like in class. I give you guys the opportunity to kind of critique and send comments about certain things that are working, certain things that aren't working. You guys do a great job of letting me know, hey, your mic's not working well right now, or you're not talking loud enough, or you're talking too loud. And those are things that I want to know because I want to make it as best I can for my students. And so the government should take that into consideration as well and want to be made aware of the wrongs that they might be doing so that way it can be fixed and what's best for the American people and the common good is protected. So these acts did not last very long. They were dropped and became null and void, but these were really the biggest X on the presidency of John Adams. And this is what many people pointed to and said, is this what we want for another 4 years? And it really hurt his reelection chances after his first term because most people remembered not that he kept us out of war, but they remembered the wrong things. And that's really how society has always worked. For all the good things that somebody does, one wrong can almost seem like it erases whatever good somebody did. And it's also, the Alien and Sedition Acts were near the end of John Adams' presidency, and most people remember what you did last. So regardless of how you started, if you finished the wrong way, or if you did something recently that hurt people or upset people, that's what they're going to remember more than any good that has been done.